Two by-elections on a knife edge, a fresh round of peace talks for Syria, and the government hits shaky ground over business rates rises. Welcome to TIP TV Politics. On the show this week, Elijah Magnier talks us through the latest from Iraq and Syria, Suren Thiru from the British Chambers of Commerce, and talking us through the week's news, Asa Bennett, assistant comment editor at The Telegraph, and Matt Shaddick, head of political odds at Ladbrokes. Let's begin with the upcoming by-election. Thursday, we'll find out whether the traditional Labour heartland constituencies of Stoke Central and Copeland will be sticking red, shifting purple, or possibly even turning blue. Speaking to the Parliamentary Labour Party last night, Corbyn described the election as on a knife edge. Prime Minister Theresa May, meanwhile, has visited both constituencies, interpreted as a show of confidence about her party's performance at the ballot box. But what about the People's Army of UKIP? Well, its leader and candidate in the Stoke by-election, Paul Nuttall, still faces the backlash against false claims on his website that he lost close friends in the Hillsborough disaster. Other than losing two senior UKIP officials in Liverpool, it's now rumoured Nuttall could be beaten by the Conservatives to third place. Matt Shaddick, you've been looking at the polling data from the past month in Stoke Central in particular. What's it been showing?
Well, the interesting thing is not much polling data to go on, which is actually quite good for us in the world of betting because, it's people's opinions that are forming the betting markets. And I guess you can see from the trend lines, UKIP were briefly favourites at the end of last month to win this by-election. But the lines have started diverging, particularly since the Hillsborough comments, Hillsborough issue that Nuttall's had, you were mentioning. And right now we're saying, the betting market is saying it's about a 60% chance that Labour are going to hold on in Stoke. I guess the really interesting move over the last couple of days is that the Tories were 33-1 to win this on Sunday. They're now 6-1. So somebody somewhere thinks this is going to get quite close.
I mean, in terms of Labour, because obviously this is a traditional Labour heartland constituency, what are the main factors which are putting off people from voting as they always have done?
Well, it doesn't really look like that Corbyn-friendlier a seat, does it? It hasn't really got the demographics that he tends to do well in. And, of course, it was quite pro-Leave, so you might think that UKIP should do better here. Certainly, demographically, this should be a very good seat for UKIP. Their leaders standing. And there aren't that many people betting Labour. I mean, even though they're favourites Labour here, the betting markets aren't all that confident about them holding on. So it really wouldn't surprise me, any of three results here right now.
And in terms of turnout, what's the suggestions about how many people are going to be?
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. So Ladbrokes have got a market on the turnouts. This was this may have been the lowest turnout seat in England at the general election. I think it was under 50%. We put our line in at around 31%. When we open up betting, that's been brought up to around 35% right now. So that's where the market's expecting it, somewhere around 35% turnouts. Those sorts of low turnouts typically tend to help the more organised campaigns, I guess you might say. And if reports to be believed, then Labour have got a much better handle on postal voting and so on, so perhaps that'll help them.
And in terms of UKIP, Paul Nuttall, obviously, he's had a pretty bad week and a half. It has been really significant, the impact in Stoke, hasn't it, these revelations about Hillsborough? Or at least it looks like.
Yeah, I mean, the betting markets think so, but there's a lot of evidence in other elections in the last year or so even that betting markets can often overreact to these sorts of stories. The most recent bit of information people get, people tend to overreact. We saw lots of examples of that in the US and in the Brexit referendum. I'd be surprised if the Hillsborough stuff made all that much difference, but it comes on top of a number of other problems he's had. So, yeah, it hasn't been a great campaign for them so far.
Asa, is it significant or even bizarre that we're now talking about the Conservatives doing well in Labour heartlands in the north?
Well, it's absolutely fascinating because the stereotype has always been that the South is robustly Conservative, while the North is the Labour heartland, safe as anything, through thick or thin, it will vote Labour. And in this case, we look at Copeland, obviously vacated by Jamie Reid, and the Conservatives are poised to take that, given, for one simple reason, for example, they actually quite like nuclear power, they like Trident, they like the nuclear Sellafield plant that employs many people in Copeland. They don't want to shut it down as part of some Corbynite CND evangelism. They want to actually respect that. That probably cuts through a lot, as well as them being competent anyway. Not providing the Corbyn style of Brexit leadership where he votes for and against it and, shrug your shoulders indifferent about it.
In terms of Theresa May appearing at in both constituencies during this election campaign, what message is the Conservative Party trying to send there?
Well, obviously the Tories wouldn't send the Prime Minister to a campaign unless they were extremely confident or thought they were in with a shout. So indeed, Copeland, that's what they've been really focusing their resources in on, getting Theresa May out there with the troops. And then Stoke was fascinating, because obviously she was seen there last week touring an Emma Bridgewater factory. And that at least shows one thing. They've realised, and they must be kicking themselves for not having gone all in from the beginning, but given how they see that UKIP is floundering, at the same point Labour is struggling, they really could have been getting a good message in. We have to remember with Stoke that they were only 30 votes behind the UKIP at the general election. It was not just a simple Labour-UKIP race.
So you're very much suggesting that in Copeland it's going to be, in Stoke it's going to be potentially a Conservative in second place,
yes,
pipping UKIP to third.
They could do remarkably well, I'd say.
So for you, Paul Nuttall really has, was it the Hillsborough effect for you which has really ruined his chances?
I mean, but I'm not really sure who done it in this kind of Cluedo we're going to enact for the UKIP campaign, because I would actually be sceptical of the Hillsborough effect, given that, the betting markets, all respect to Matthew, they have been wrong on previous occasions. But instead, what we're looking at instead is the campaign noise. You have to understand with Stoke, a lot of people won't be voting, a lot of people won't care. They won't care about the Hillsborough stuff because it'll just be campaign to and fro. But at the same point, they won't care so much about Gareth Snell, the Labour candidate's tweets. They'll think it's just Westminster Beltway issues. They'll think about local things. What will it matter for me? They may be outraged, some of them may be outraged, furious about Paul Nuttall's tweets, but not his tweets, pardon me, his press releases. But they won't have this sort of arcane knowledge that the Westminster Village seems to have about what did he say in 2011? What did he say the year after? Oh my God, he's continuing on with this. How dare he? And so if they don't vote, it's irrelevant for them.
Now, in April, the government's revaluation of business rates in England will be introduced, the first since 2010. It's a form of tax. It applies to non-residential premises like pubs, shops and offices. It's like a commercial version of council tax. And herein lies the problem. In London in particular, the rates are expected to go up about 11% this year. 13 of the UK's biggest employers' groups have written a letter calling for it to be dropped. Earlier I spoke to Suren Thiru, Head of Economics and Business Finance at the British Chambers of Commerce.
Well, the big issue and why there's such an outcry over the last few days is that last time properties were valued was back in 2010. Now, since then, values have shifted wildly across the country, creating win and losers across the UK. While there'll be a fair proportion of businesses who are actually benefiting from this shake-up, and many are stand to lose big, really, and they're going to see quite huge increases in their business rates bill. And this comes at a time when they're facing increases in other input costs, which are weighing down on their ability to grow their business.
And so when the government says that it's making business rates fairer, and that all this talk about the implications for smaller businesses and businesses, particularly in London, is just scaremongering, what's your response to that?
Well, one of the major issues that's coming out over the evaluations is that many locally based businesses are set to fare worse than some global giants, and that has insult injury from many businesses who are the bedrock of their communities. Now, another bone of contention, of course, is that the government are looking to restrict the extent to which businesses can appeal their business rates valuations. And this will mean that many businesses will be paying over the odds for their business rates bill, and that comes at a time when other costs are going up.
And you're one of the 13 major business groups, the British Chambers of Commerce, who've signed this letter to the government opposing these changes. Are you actually wanting the government to go back on these proposed business rates changes altogether?
Well, what we would like the government to do is to act to soften the blow of the rate rises for many of the firms who are deeply affected. Now, there's a number of ways they can do this. One of our proposals is then to bring forward a reduction in the business rates multiplier, which determines the annual increases between valuations from RPI to CPI, which is set to happen at the moment in 2020. What we're asking them to do is bring it forward this year, and that will help cushion some of the effects of the rising rates bills. What we're also asking the government to do is to drop their plans to restrict the ability of firms to appeal unfair valuations.
Asa, how troubled are the Conservatives in Parliament with these business rates rises?
Well, it's fascinating because the Conservatives are deeply unhappy with this because it runs against everything they hold dear. The idea of being supportive of small business, helping the entrepreneur out. And instead, you've got this sort of big state idea, big lumbering tax that's weighing down on them. So this is why they're very much unsettled. Because the Conservatives are meant to be competent and in tune with the business community, and so this just runs countercultural for them.
And in terms of what Philip Hammond's going to be doing, there's been rumours, at least reports, that he's indicated he's prepared to take measures in the budget to help those worst affected by these business rates hikes, in an olive branch to his backbench Tories. Do we know any more about that?
Well, I think it's looking very likely he's going to have to act, because the government line is that they're in listening mode, quote unquote, about it. And that was the same word that was used before the government climbed down on tax credits and cutting them, for example. So they know that they're onto a hiding to nothing, in a sense, here. And given it's the Tory MPs here who are pointing out that many of their businesses in their communities are going to be worst hit, and there's this rather sort of nasty war of words going on between Sajid Javid and fellow MPs, where he's trying to say, oh, there's all this sort of disinformation out. Here's what the original impact's going to be. It's going to be fine, everyone, and they're firing back saying, no, you're lying, actually, and murmurs are going around saying, does the Prime Minister really have confidence in Mr Javid? What's happening here? The backlash is brewing right now, and Hammond is going to have to act. What is helping him, actually, is the recent public finance figures. They suggest that he has about, at least 9 billion to play with. Some may want him to spend on the NHS, but the Tories are definitely going to be keen for him to respond for business rates.
OK, right, thank you very much. We'll leave that there. Now, on to our InFocus section. On Thursday, officials from the Syrian government and opposition figures will begin talks in Geneva aimed at ending their country's 6-year conflict. It's the 4th round of UN-brokered talks, with the most recent attempt in December last year ending in bitter failure. But what should we be expecting from the coming negotiations? This week, I went in focus with Elijah Magnier, Chief International Correspondent and War Correspondent for Al Rai. Elijah Magnier, thank you for joining us today. Just give me a quick overview of what is the aim of these peace talks, what's on the agenda, and what are they hoping to achieve?
Well, thank you for having me. The Geneva talk aims to reach not only a ceasefire, but as Stéphane de Mistura said, he would like to see a change of the constitution and early election in Syria, which is something that is not very easy to achieve these days.
And in terms of who's invited to these talks, who's going to be attending these talks and negotiating in these talks, are they the people who are going to be able to make a real substantial difference to what's happening in Syria on the ground?
Not at all. Those who hold the ground and are more powerful on the ground are Al-Qaeda under different names. So we knew Al-Qaeda as al-Nusra. Today we know it as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Ahrar al-Sham, these used to be more pro-Turkey, but they rejected the Turkish request to attend in Kazakhstan, and they're not going to Geneva. And obviously ISIS, the Islamic State, as a terrorist organization, is not invited. So these 3 groups are not present in Geneva talk, and those who are present are only opposition groups who are pro-Saudi Arabia, pro-Turkey, pro-Qatar, and they really can't make a lot of difference on the ground.
So is there any reason then for us to be in any way more optimistic about these talks in comparison to the talks that have come before?
On the contrary, the groups that used to be aligned with Turkey today have been given a choice either to join Al-Qaeda or to join Ahrar al-Sham, and the third part went to join the Turkish forces attacking ISIS in the north of Syria, in Al-Bab, and all these are not present. Nevertheless, there is a group that is present in Douma, in the suburb of Damascus, Jaish al-Islam, and this group is strong around Damascus, not in the north of Syria. And if what Russia and Damascus are trying to do is to take the group that accept the deal one after the other to make sure that they can divide the problem and sort out one group at a time. If they manage to sort out that the problem with Jaish al-Islam around Damascus, then the whole of area between Damascus and Homs will be completely free. Now, the other point is the south of Syria. And the south of Syria, Jordan was brought in because Jordan has influence in the south of Syria. Nevertheless, we saw in the last 4 days an attack of the pro-ISIS group against those groups that are pro-Jordanian. They are very engaged in a battle right at the moment. They're losing some of the ground. And Al-Qaeda is also attacking the regime in the south of Syria, making Jordan a bit not very useful as a presence in the talk, therefore not very influential on the people who can make a difference on the ground.
And just let's talk about the US policy and its impact, particularly in its time of change as we go into a new administration. What's the impact of the uncertainty surrounding the US policy with regards to Syria, with regards to ISIS, do you think, on these talks, and indeed the situation in Syria in general?
The US policy so far is very gloomy and unclear. When President Trump said he's going to fight terrorism, he mentioned ISIS without talking about Al-Qaeda. And Al-Qaeda is much more dangerous than ISIS in Syria because Al-Qaeda is infiltrated among the population and is part of a big part of the population in the north of Syria, while ISIS is completely isolated, is a kind of orphan without any international or national or domestic support or regional support. Therefore, Trump's policy to attack ISIS on its own is really just addressing one part of the problem. The other problem in the US policy is Trump is supporting the Kurds in the north of Syria and sending weapons and intelligence officers and special forces to support the advance of the Kurds toward Raqqa. That is not that easy to be done. Because first of all, the Kurds are considered by the Turk as terrorists. Therefore, Turkey is not happy with the support to the Kurds. The Kurds cannot take over Raqqa because there are around 10,000 with the Arabs that are fighting along the SDF group, and the SDF is the Syrian Democratic Forces. And if we look at the city of Mosul, of course, Mosul is much bigger than Raqqa, but it requires between 50 to 60,000 well-trained, ideologically strong fighters in Iraq to attack ISIS in Mosul, while we see 10,000 of the Kurds and the Arabs, not very clear who's going to win what. Therefore, the attack against Raqqa is a bit of a dream. Of course, the US can surround a part of Raqqa, but there is a big part of the land between Al-Bab and Raqqa that is still under ISIS. So it's not a feasible plan.
Sure. Well, let's just talk about the external players. We've just spoken about the US policy there. In terms of Russia, in terms of Turkey, perhaps we can focus on Russia here. How important is their interventions and their policy towards Syria going to be in the coming years?
Russia wants stability in Syria and wants to avoid the partition of the country. The way things are going now, Syria, the north of Syria, is going to be divided. A part for Turkey, that is already occupying a big part of Syria, more or less 5,000 kilometers. And we see the Kurds supported by the US advancing toward Raqqa, and these will have their military base in the northeast of Syria. Therefore, Syria is divided, and that doesn't suit the Russians. The Russian wants a stable Syria where they can keep their military base, naval fleet on the Mediterranean from the Syrian Tartus base, and they want to see the end of the war, regardless what Assad or Iran want. Assad and Iran, they want to liberate the whole of Syria. This is not a possible plan. Russia wants to reach an agreement between the rebels and the government of Damascus, where everybody can sit around the table and find a way out where everybody is a winner and nobody is a loser.
Okay, well, let's just turn now to the Iraqi army attack on Mosul, or assault on Mosul. The reports in the UK said there's only a few thousand IS fighters now left in Mosul, but it's still very hard for the Iraqi army to gain more land and to take the city in full. What's making it so hard for the Iraqi army now?
Normally, when you have an attacking forces against a defender, you need more or less 4 to 5 to 1. Secondly, the west side of Mosul, that is situated on the right bank, it's the old city of Mosul. So it's the old part. It's contained very small, narrow, old ancient streets, where ISIS can easily have multiple tunnels. They can open holes from one house to another and make the life very difficult for the people for the Iraqi army attacking. Moreover, there are around 500 to 750,000 civilians in the city. That's not an easy urban warfare to conduct when there are many civilians and the streets are very narrow. You can't use the air strikes, but against very limited area, and you need really the infantry to go on the ground. The east part of Mosul, which is the left bank, that was a bit easier because it contained more open space, particularly around the university, around the garden area. And in other streets, it's fairly newer than the west side of Mosul.
Right, okay. And just finally, just your very brief thoughts on what has been the impact of the immigration ban that Donald Trump's administration has brought in. We've had news today that the Trump administration is planning to roll out as early as this week a revised executive order on the immigration executive order, which he says will protect our people. In terms of how that's been interpreted in Iraq in particular, how do you see that as being interpreted by the Iraqi people towards the US?
It's a bit strange because there is a high level of cooperation on the military level between Iraq and the US. There are many delegations, many trainings involved, many selling of weapons and arms, aircraft, helicopters, all kinds of weaponry. And there is a large scale of cooperation between the two countries. So Trump needs to really be extremely selective on who would go into the country, if we take Iraq, for example, and who is banned and is not allowed. If Trump is concerned about terrorism, we haven't seen in the last 10 years any immigrant who became a terrorist or a homegrown terrorist coming from any immigrant setup in the US or in other places in Europe. It's not that straightforward. Therefore, and the majority of the immigrants were Christian rather than Muslims.
Right.
It just doesn't make a lot of sense.
Okay, right, we're going to have to leave that there. Elijah Magnier, the Chief International Correspondent for Al Rai, thank you very much for coming on the programme.
Pleasure.
Asa, what's the likelihood of the House of Lords impacting on the government's March Brexit timetable?
Well, I'm quietly confident, actually, because you take how the Lords treated it for its second reading. Some of them complained, but ultimately there was a broad consensus that they wanted to respect it, they wanted to wave it through, they didn't want to sabotage it quite yet. Anyway, even the ones who are most vindictive about this, they were going to wait till the third reading to debate these amendments. And yes, let's say that there might be one or two that will get through. This has to go back to the Commons, sure, but the Commons will win the day in the end, we have to remember, and the Lords realises this.
I mean, in terms, Matt, in terms of where Brexit is, let's go back to the by-election. How important is the issue of Brexit and Article 50 and Labour's position in deciding those seats? How much of a reaction does it prompt from the electorate there?
I mean, the Tories obviously think it's a problem because they talk a lot about it and how the Labour Party can obstruct Brexit. And I dare say there's a section of the population who are worried about it. I mean, but if I look at Copeland, most of the reporting there seems to be saying Labour are concentrating on the local health service, which I imagine is a much more direct, immediate kind of concern for most voters there. It certainly makes Labour's life tricky in a lot of these sorts of seats. Actually, in Copeland, though, I understand what Asa was saying about that seat. I still think there's a fair chance Labour will win that. If I was having a bet right now, I'd be backing Labour to win Copeland at 5-2.
Even despite the concerns of nuclear.
Yeah. I mean, that certainly plays into the Conservatives' hands. And I'm not saying they're not the most likely winners. I think they are. But given this, we have absolutely no polling. Just remember just how incredibly rare it is for governments to win seats from the opposition during parliaments. Just virtually never happens. Hasn't happened since 1982. 5-2 seems like a fairly good price to me.
And in terms of Jeremy Corbyn, obviously he imposed a 3-line whip on his MPs for triggering Article 50. Has that had any impact, positive or negative, in these seats?
Well, what we've seen is as people have started to realise there's a possibility that Labour could lose both of these seats on Thursday, it's a 2-to-1 shot that they lose them both. No matter how strong Corbyn's party position seems to be in the party internally, he's going to come under more pressure if they lose both those seats. So we have seen some people backing Corbyn to be replaced this year. That's down to 5-4 now. The chance of him surviving to 2020 now to 7-4, I think. Some people, the anti-Corbyn wing of the Labour Party, would say the best thing that could happen to Labour this week is they lose both these seats, and that hastens Corbyn's departure.
And of course, we had on the show last week, we had people talking about the possible Labour leaders of the future being road tested, but I have to say not much was made of that from our commentators last week, but who knows? Asa, just going back to the Brexit bill in the Lords at the moment, in terms of what the big prize is for some in the Lords, would it be the rights of EU citizens and the rights of expats living in Europe? Is that an amendment that they really want to secure from the government?
I think that there is definitely a palpable appetite for it, but they know, and the government has made this clear, that they can't secure it officially until Article 50's been in vote, until the Brexit talks are underway. So for the moment, they might well try and get these amendments on, and the government will say, yes, we do agree, it is important to secure these rights, but we have to invoke Article 50 first, everyone. So it's going to be kind of, dare I suggest, virtue signalling of sorts. They want to get the amendment forward, they will get a lovely amount of support, let's say, but then, it's not going to sabotage anything at the end of the day. It's just Brexit will come through.
And there's a new TV documentary out next week covering the House of Lords, inside the House of Lords, which shines a light on the problem of Lords going in and claiming their expenses and going out again without doing much of a public service. This public perception of the House of Lords, are they walking a tightrope, as it were, that if they start obstructing or be seen to obstructing the will of the elected chamber, they're going to become unstuck? Or is really that a bit of a scaremongering technique from MPs who really just want the House of Lords to wave it through?
I mean, I think they're acutely aware of their responsibilities here, in that they have privileged positions of scrutiny. They can't dictate law. They, have to adjudicate by all means, speak up, but the Commons are the ultimate lawmakers here. They have supremacy. This is codified in the 1911 Parliament Act. So, there are various methods Theresa May has to get this through. She can even, if you wanted to, flood the House of Lords of all sorts of Eurosceptic peers, Lord Bill Cash, Lord Rees-Mogg, you name it, they would be there. But that takes time and would be messy, of course. There may even be a sort of snap general election if necessary to justify this as a mandate. This would be messy if it went that far, but they know this. They don't want to avoid that sort of stuff. They want to keep their seats. They want to have their allowances, and that's why they probably will, stick to the status quo, not rock the boat.
Okay, well, we'll just have to wait and see. Matt Shaddick, Head of Political Odds at Ladbrokes, and Asa Bennett, Assistant Comment Editor at The Telegraph. Thank you very much for coming on today.
Thank you.
Right, that's all we've got time for this week. But don't forget, you can catch videos, comment, and much more on our Facebook page and on Twitter at TipTV Politics. Join me again next week for all the latest news in the week's political agenda. Until then, goodbye.
Thank you.